Welcome to Rising Up for Justice, a special weekly series presented by Rising Up with Sonali, an independently produced, subscriber-supported program syndicated to radio stations FreeSpeechTV and podcast platforms. I'm SonaliKolhatkar, host and executive producer. Our nation and our world are overrun by billionaires and bigots, but they are few and we are many. On this series, exclusive to subscribers of Rising Up with Sonali and viewers of Free Speech TV, we'll hear from organizers in the movements for social justice, and we'll dig into the nuts and bolts of values, strategies, tactics, narratives, and building power. This week on Rising Up for Justice, I'm joined by ChrisKutalik, Director of Communications for SURJ, which stands for Showing Up for Racial Justice. Chris is also the former Communications Director of DSA, editor of Labor Notes, and was a union officer. Welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So let's begin first with what SURJ is. It is, as I said, it stands for Showing Up for Racial Justice. How do you summarize the goals of your organization, and how you go about achieving those goals? It sounds like it's fairly obvious from the title.
It's obvious, but there's certainly some nuances to it. We were founded as an organization explicitly to sort of flank Black people in motion, the Black movement, people of color movements, and the movement against racism. And our explicit mission was the very hard task of organizing white people out of their racism and around shared interest into sort of like support and getting rid of their, and ditching their racism and supporting the fight for a multiracial democracy. So for about 20 years, we've been moving around that very specific goal of moving white people out of racism.
In a country that has its origins in white supremacy, this is a gargantuan task, especially at this moment when the progress on racial justice is being rapidly eroded. Has SURJ's have your goals evolved? Have your tactics to achieve those goals evolved in light of where we are today?
Absolutely. We started as an organization right after the election of President Obama, and in seeing the kind of white backlash to that presidency. So we started kind of around that frame of trying to move white people around racism and out of their racism and finding kind of shared interest in that moment. But that's certainly morphed along with those kind of social movements. So pretty rapidly into the 2010s, as you had this like rising movement against police brutality and police assaults and police deaths of Black youth, particularly, and the kind of rise of a movement against sort of the carceral, incarceration in the carceral system, we became a movement and an organization that was really focused on creating kind of spaces and movement around for white people to plug in as allies around the Black liberation movement, around the Black Lives Matters movement. So we had our first kind of big bumps in terms of like relevance and organization and scale as a national movement and a national organization around Ferguson riots in 2014. And of course, around the George Floyd uprising, we had a really sort of critical uptick in organizing. So for quite a while, that sustained us. We rose to a movement of around 150 chapters nationwide. And in recent years, we've continued with that mission, but we've also added, particularly because of the rise of white supremacy and the rise of the authoritarian right, and the fact that it is installed into the highest levels of the government, thanks to the Trump administration. We've also shifted into the kind of broader anti-authoritarian movement and into the movement of electing and getting mixed into electoral politics with like working class populists who are trying to move white people, but also trying to move people of color, working class folks around sort of a shared interest, pro-solidarity, working class kind of populist message. And that's one thing that we've really been leaning into this year.
I'd love to explore the intersection between race and class from your perspective, because we, have had, especially on the left, historically, there's been this reluctance to address racial injustice because people have wanted everything to be reduced to, well, it's all about class. But of course, it's not just all about class, right? We aren't colorblind. Institutional racism shows up so starkly along racial lines. I should say institutional systemic discrimination shows up along racial lines. So how do you navigate those conversations around race and class with the understanding that we are all affected by the same things, but to different degrees?
I think that's a pretty critical question, and one that has been key, especially to our shifts in organization and our shifts in politics. We've always paid some attention to how race and class intersect, but it has been becoming a bigger and bigger core mission, especially as we've seen that one of the durable elements of the Trump coalition, unfortunately, has been making massive inroads into supporting into gaining support from the white working class. And we know that it's been a relatively durable coalition until recently. And I think what we have seen in the last few months, there was an excellent New York Times article looking at the research around this, is that there's been a massive shift away from support of Trump and support of MAGA, specifically around losing around affordability issues. But that's not just to say like, oh, the price of eggs has gone up and so people have stopped supporting Trump. I mean, it is true to some extent. It's like not being able to deliver the goods kind of shows the falseness of a billionaire who's obviously catering to sort of plutocratic elements in the rich is its falseness. But it's also like he's losing them on immigration. The white working class has shifted some of its views on, for instance, support for ICE and support for really aggressive and racist policies like that. So you've seen this kind of massive shift, and that's also gone along with the small percentage of Black and Latino working class people that supported him in 2024 who voted for him and now massively shifted. So you're seeing a 20% slide in that. But it is something that we've been paying particular attention to. One of our quieter but large scale organizing efforts has been what around our department called the Grassroots Organizing Department. And in that place, in that part of our organization, we have been doing base building community organizing in both Tennessee and Kentucky, particularly in parts of Georgia, where we're going into white working class neighborhoods and been there for a number of years, smaller cities, and organizing people around tenants unions and housing rights, around community issues, the kinds of things that we need to be able to do to move people in the white working class is by pointing out that they have a shared interest in organizing alongside and with Black people and with Latino people and with Asian folks and other people of color communities, because when we're divided by race, and when the white working class is divided by race and kind of mixed out, we know that we also tend to lose things like tend to lose out on the solidarity dividend of what Heather McGhee says of better public goods, things like affordable health care and housing costs and higher wages due to unions, because we allow ourselves to be divided away inside of our class around our natural allies, which is the multiracial working class.
I appreciate that answer so much. The ways in which you work, particularly in southern states, is that something that has geographic differences, and why the South? Is that generally because that's where Republicans have poured a lot of focus and managed to convince a lot of people. It is a place that has such contradictions and I suppose is ripe for organizing.
Oh, sure. As a native Texan myself, I mean, I grew up with it and I grew up with that kind of division, but I also grew up with a different history, which is the history of like Southern folks involved in the Union, Southern folks involved in the Civil Rights Movement, white people that were moved to action across the racial lines and created sort of solidarity cultures. So that is something we clearly do. We have a national organizing department that focuses on electoral. It focuses on especially on working around the anti-ICE movement. But we have this department, and why we keep this commitment to organizing in the South, particularly, is that we know that it is extremely hard work and it is a long-term project and is a durable project that has to happen though, that like the long, slow, deep organizing of moving white people, especially in the kind of bastions, the previous sort of bastions of like support for Trump and support for and support against or at least hostility to union organizing drives like the ones that have happened in the foreign transplants in the auto industry. That's been a key place where new member organizing has happened by the United Auto Workers, is in places like Chattanooga, Tennessee, and all through Tennessee and Kentucky, where a number of companies such as Toyota and Volkswagen have set up massive factories. And we know that, like, if we want to regain strength for all working people, that the road kind of leads at least in part, if not strongly, through the South.
You were talking earlier about allying, particularly alongside Black liberation organizations and around the Black Lives Matter organizing. What about immigrant rights, especially given today so many of the divisions that Trump and his party have sown between Americans and people who either are immigrants or have immigrant backgrounds or look like immigrants? Those are along racial lines as well. It isn't really about immigration status. That's a sort of a dog whistle for race. And our lives, the lives of white Americans and immigrants, are so deeply intertwined that we don't necessarily question it till somebody like Trump comes along and says, oh, the reason you're suffering is because that brown person over there cut in line and took your job. So is that an issue that you work on?
Oh, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right to point out how highly racialized the views and the mobilization around immigration is in this country. And we have found that it is a critical arena for us to struggle around, particularly, of course, with the last year, and we just celebrated here in Los Angeles. We just celebrated or commemorated rather the 1 year anniversary of the massive raids that started at Home Depots here in Los Angeles, and not only sort of created a whole arc of ICE mass mobilizations to terrorize cities such as DC and Chicago, and of course, tragically in Minneapolis, but also jump-started an entire large-scale movement, which I think is deeply critical to our organizing this mass movement of people in each of these communities, but across the nation, to defend immigrants with community patrols, walking kids to school, hotlines, IDing, and being able to organize around ICE mobilizations, the new wave of solidarity actions around Delaney Hall, this private prison and detention center that that inside detainees have gone on a hunger strike and labor strikes because they're being paid something like $1 a day to work. It's literally kind of almost slave-like conditions, many of them unlawfully detained in that place. So we're seeing this rise of this major mass movement pushing back and really kind of limiting the ability for them to do this sort of entirely kind of racist and racialized, and authoritarian movement to terrorize whole communities, and not just immigrants, although of course that has been the major impact, but across race and class lines to most anyone who supports or has even a sympathy or solidarity with immigrant workers. So we find this to be a critical place for anti-racists and white anti-racists to be working and organizing and creating motion around. It particularly is continuing to move in favor of immigrant rights and against, and it's certainly against the kind of authoritarian agenda of demonizing and creating a massive carceral system to kind of continue in this line. And I think, in the years to come, we hope to be starting to make gains and kind of push back on it. I think the movement has risen to a particularly powerful place, but we have a long way to go.
You mentioned earlier that you're working in the electoral arena, and so much of the current backlash we're seeing today around racial groups, by Trump, was because people couldn't handle. Or they were told they shouldn't handle the presidency of Barack Obama. To the idea that a person of color could represent electorally and democratically a multiracial group, white and people of color, it shouldn't be controversial, but of course it always has been. Tell me about some of the ways in which SURJ has been involved in electoral politics, and particularly in electing progressives of color to various offices, and how you've done that, how you've managed to convince other white folks that it is in everyone's interest to have, someone like a Jamal Bowman or Summer Lee representing them.
Yeah, our entry into electoral politics was relatively late as an organization, but it really started to pick up steam when we were supporting BLM and supporting the Black Lives Matter, that is, and supporting the movement for alternatives to police brutality and alternatives to policing and alternatives to carceral system. We started really small scale. But successfully in Kentucky, and especially around in Louisville, um, organizing around judges' races and trying to get people who have a much more progressive outlook elected to the bench. And we were relatively successful with those movements. And as we did that, we noticed that, and especially during the Trump years, that that social movements cannot act without having some kind of movement or motion or ability to elect left and movement candidates in the electoral sphere. So our very first kind of national interventions were around defending the squad, that we saw and felt like that the squad, which was, these highly progressive women of color, um, Congress people, mostly women of color, including Jamal Bowman, um, were being consistently attacked by interests supporting lobbies around Israel, but also business lobbies and right-wing lobbies, and some pieces of the Democratic establishment that were attempting to kind of throw them out in some of the biggest high-dollar primaries to that date. And so we became involved with that movement. Some of those races were unsuccessful, unfortunately. Some of them were successful, like in the case of Summer Lee. And through that, we started creating an electoral program that started kind of taking up steam. And in 2020, had a number of successes down ballot in southern states and in other states. And more recently, we've had tremendous success behind a number of kind of strong working class champions of pro-solidarity views, because one, it's about, one, reaching the white working class through affordability issues and through the issues that really matter to them. But it's also about not backing off and in fact being very strong on and clear that these candidates and our organization continue to be against ICE, continue to be against the sort of racist agenda of the Trump administration, and have clear lines. And we've seen remarkable, remarkable wins around this kind of messaging. Bob Brooks, who is a union leader who won in Pennsylvania in a red district and is very likely to flip that congressional seat in November. We see Randy Villegas, one of the first progressive Latino candidates, winning in Bakersfield, California, in the Central Valley, in a district that's been ruby red previously, and is extremely likely to win that race come November. So we're seeing that there is like this that we can create this coalition, working class centered coalition that includes white people moved out of their racism in electoral races, and that can be the factor that increases those increases those races to the chance of actually flipping seats from Republicans come November. And I feel like we've been 4 for 4 in this election, and I feel like we're going to see a lot more of those races win, and it's an exciting time to do that.
I want to hone in a little bit more on your narrative work, particularly when it comes to talking to white people about race. It's easy to get defensive, especially if someone has voted for Trump once, maybe even twice, and is having second thoughts and feels shame. On your website, under your values section, you talk about calling people in. And this is, I think, reference perhaps to Loretta Ross's work, who wrote a book about calling in and gives online courses around it, which is the opposite of calling out. Instead of calling out people, which can, of course, end up making them feel cornered, she suggests calling people in. So how does SURJ do that sort of work, bringing people into the fold? Because I think, especially for people of color, one of the things that I often see people of color when we think about white supremacy and white racism is, why aren't other white folks calling their people into task and, helping them see the light?
It's a critical task, and it's one that has been the central core of our mission and what we want to accomplish as a social movement since the beginning, and has been sort of our North Star as we've gone forward, is the belief that not only can white people be moved out of racism and moved out of sort of this aggressive alliance around white supremacy and around racial issues, but that they can change. And we looked back to, and we're highly informed when we started our project from the legacy of white participants or white leaders inside of the Southern civil rights movement, particularly like Ann Braden and others who came out of, who were longtime participants in the civil rights movement, who had, as Ann Braden said, this abiding faith that every white Southerner was in a series of flux, that they could really go either way. That they have been enculturated and soaked into this long history that goes back to slavery and Reconstruction and the Civil War and the kind of rise of white supremacy as like a ideology afterwards, but that their shared interest, or their interest, and the kind of moral core of people was still in play. And so we had this sort of guiding vision that no one is truly kind of like really lost, that everyone can be pushed in some way on it. And I do believe that that kind of calling people in and finding a source where you can find, a good organizer can find that unity of interest, which is that we all want to live in a safe society. We most all want to live in a democracy that feels like almost all people can participate, even if you sort of believe in this kind of racial divide and conquer ideology. When you get down to it, most people don't want to live in a garrison state. Most people don't want to live in a place that's constantly racially mobilized in a war against all. I think most people would prefer to be in a strong multiracial democracy. And I do believe that we have a moral obligation, and we have an activist concrete need to like be able to find the people in our lives and push them around it. It's not to make excuses. It's not to say, okay, well, they're inherently good and they'll come around eventually. But it's to be active participants by like finding joint commonalities and pushing them to do those. Not enough to say these things. It's more important to show up. And that's why it's in our name. It's most important to show up at that rally. It's most important to show up at that ballot box to pull this thing. It's to show up to educate yourself, to show up to find and not just as kind of like, wringing your hands and abdicating responsibility, but taking actual responsibility and taking action around it is critical.
And finally, Chris, who are some of the groups that you work closely with? I know you mentioned immigrant rights groups, Black liberation groups, and Black rights organizations. Who in general are your natural allies? Are there other groups like yours of white anti-racists working for multiracial democracies who you also see as your allies?
I mean, we're certainly the largest organization that has this lane in the country, which is not to say that we are the only exclusive one. There are a number of organizations, and to our credit, there are a number of chapters, our chapters, and we have well over 100 of them that on their own and in self-organizing as volunteers and as members of their community create this kind of every day or every week are creating this kind of level of organization in this lane.
And the website is?
www.surj.org.
That's
and you can find
SURJ.org.
That is correct. Thank you.
Chris, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Good luck to you.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for having us.
My guest has been ChrisKutalik, Director of Communications for Showing Up for Racial Justice, SURJ. And this is Rising Up for Justice. I'm SonaliKolhatkar, host and executive producer of this new weekly half-hour series exclusive to viewers of FreeSpeechTV and subscribers of my long-standing program, Rising Up with Sonali. You can find out more at risingupwithsonali.com.